Welcome to Magnificent Minds, where we explore the science of child development with both heart and reason, bringing clarity, compassion, and scientific evidence to questions that matter deeply to families. Today, we're talking about something that many parents think about, whether their child is a teen, in elementary school, or even still a toddler. And that's what the future will look like, especially what it will be like transitioning to adulthood. So, whatever age your child is, it's never too early to think about this because the skills that support independence in adulthood begin developing in childhood. To help us explore this topic, I'm joined by two wonderful colleagues from my team at Cortica, Meaghan O'Dea Johnson, pediatric nurse practitioner and dietitian, and Dr. Haley Masterson, pediatric neurologist, both of whom work closely with children, adolescents, and families navigating transitions like this. They bring not only medical expertise, but also deep experience helping families think about independence, relationships, health, and the many paths that adulthood can take. Thank you both so much for being here. Before we dive in, I would love to hear what drew each of you to working with autistic children and adults.
Sure. Well, I think it's the best job in the world, but I'm a little bit biased on that one. And I really love the families and value the families. I do have a brother with autism. He is older than me. So I have some experience in that perspective as well. But I do feel I would have chosen this career either way because it's just the most interesting one.
For me, as a dietitian, I worked with people across the lifespan, and what really helped me focus in on pediatrics was the fact that children grow and develop. There's so much progress to be made. It's always forward moving, and that to me made it feel especially meaningful. This field specifically, I did some primary care and some mental and behavioral health, and I realized that there was really big gaps in care for children with autism.
Yeah, yeah. Um, all of us, at Cortica, we work with individuals across the lifespan, from really from birth up through adulthood. And so I think we're really well positioned to guide families, no matter how young their children are, to really thinking about the future and independence in adulthood. I know that a lot of parents of young children with autism do worry about the future. What are your thoughts on, is it ever too early to start thinking about adulthood and the transition to adulthood? And how can families approach that, especially families of young children, without feeling overwhelmed?
I think that families always start to think about the future and adulthood as soon as they have a child. And so I don't think it should be any different if your child has any diagnosis. I think one of the specific things that we can look at is making sure we're helping families get connected with their local regional center. It's a great resource early in life, like birth to three, but it's also a really fantastic resource for those transitional years when they're done with school. They offer programs to support independent living or vocational skills. And they also tend to have really great like social skills opportunities for some of those young adults. So I think it's thinking about where our child is now, knowing that no 2 or 3 year old is going to look ready to live independently, regardless of diagnoses, and making sure that we're focusing on the skills and parts of skills that are going to be like most beneficial to that child as they continue to grow. So, what can we do now that's age and developmentally appropriate to set them on a path to be able to develop the skills that we would want them to have as they transition into adulthood?
I would say that that's all completely, I totally agree. I do see some patients with autism where I think that there is an understandable amount of kind of overwhelm at the beginning, especially when we add in that potential transition to adulthood kind of piece. And I generally try to encourage families to kind of understand that that piece we can talk about more in a little bit more helpful detail as they get closer perhaps to age 8, I would say is kind of sometimes the point that I set somewhat arbitrarily, but there's so much to do before age 6, right? And age 6 isn't a hard cutoff either, but there's just so much to do in that early developmental period before we sort of transition into the school or early childhood kind of period. But I have to admit, when the time comes for a child to turn 8 years old, I almost never actually end up having that conversation because it's fairly apparent to all of us at that point. So there's this kind of natural process that often happens between diagnosis and kind of age 8, I feel, in which we kind of understand the child a lot more. And they're still not in their final form at age 8, but you can kind of start to see the shape that life might take, or at least narrow it down to a few different paths and plan in a more intentional sort of a way. But I think it all has to do with what the underlying drive or emotion is behind thinking about the future. If it's kind of proactive planning thoughts, I think it's never too early. But I think if the thoughts are kind of filled with a little bit of anxiety or dread, I would very much give families permission. Let's put those aside. There's all these wonderful things to focus on now during these years.
Yeah, I think parents will sometimes imagine adulthood like a cliff, scary, overwhelming, as something to be avoided. But the transition I find for families is much more gradual. In fact, it is less scary, but if you can approach it in sort of like I imagine sort of like stretching. It's kind of like if you got you've got a ball or a balloon or something, and just gradually stretching in different ways, and then by the time you reach that point, you'll have taken the steps that can really make some of these transitions easier. Can you think of examples where that have been really positive? Where you've seen some wonderful opportunities and developments and changes and things through kind of maybe the later teens into the early 20s.
I definitely have a lot of families where it is that cliff. So I've done this for them every day. And for whatever reason, we've decided today's the day that this child is going to pack their own lunch or do their own this or that. And I think where I've seen families and even like older teenagers make the most progress is when we've been able to really think about breaking those skills down. And eventually we can layer all of those different pieces that we've been able to be successful with together. And now we can do that whole task or routine and kind of taking things that are bigger than that, not just packing our own lunch, and breaking them into small attainable chunks so that we're really teaching the skill instead of just assuming my child is this age today and they should be doing this thing. And here it is.
I agree. I generally find the transition, in large terms to feel very gradual, but the actual moments in which skills are learned are always rather sudden. This week we showed that we can do this. This week we showed we can do this. Specifically regarding a specific example, of someone who kind of continued to learn skills in teenagers and up into the early 20s. I think the one that I can talk most freely about would probably be my brother. So my brother, Michael, does have autism. It was probably level 2, level 3 is the best way to kind of describe him. He's a fun guy. He loves birds of prey, snakes, and then anything to do with vehicles. But he really prefers to be on his own. I think for him, with the transition from childhood to adulthood, one of the biggest things was having a little bit more time to dedicate to extracurriculars, because they were sort of the vine that was still in progress, the one that he could still continue climbing up after school had kind of finished. And those extracurriculars brought him together with a lot of really fantastic adults in the special needs community where we live. It brought him community and friends. But he has a dog that he takes care of in his group home. He gets to go on walks with it, and he's able to work refilling soda containers at a convenience store, which is one of his absolute favorite things to do. And I think those are all opportunities that he actually didn't have in high school, even though he is not going to live independently. That is not in the future for him. He's in his 50s now. So, but he's still continuing to gain skills that are coming in this social setting with the community. And that's part of what I think is such a key piece of that transition to adulthood is what are you getting your fulfillment out of? What are you participating in that's a little bit bigger than just you?
Mm-hmm. What were some of those extracurriculars that helped him continue to grow and then establish relationships and have a community?
So definitely, I cannot say enough good things about Special Olympics. Where I grew up in the state of Kansas as a rural state, obviously people are far apart, and that means that services are really difficult to come by in person. But everybody can run, everybody can walk, everybody can find something in the Special Olympics that they can do, that they can participate in. And then every summer in Kansas, we would have the big state Special Olympics where all the families would come together. And you'd see people you haven't seen in ages and reach out across those connections that are so far away. And you'd find out what everybody else had been doing in the past year. And that was kind of one of the secret keys, I think, for my family is also the connection between the families to know what extracurriculars are out there. So I think we started with Special Olympics, but what he really loves is barrier-free theater. Shout out in Manhattan, Kansas, always to barrier-free theater where kids with special needs and adults with special needs can still participate in theater. That's one of my passions and so cool that Michael gets to do it. And then in addition to that, I think that's where he got kind of the social group, the friends that ended up getting him into some of the other extracurriculars as far as like arts or things that are a little bit more active in the community. But it starts with one thing and then you find the other options and you can kind of find your path.
Yeah. I mean, I can't say enough about the important role of what we might categorize as recreation or extracurriculars, but they really are so central to the success of this period of life, especially right of the teen years and adulthood, and they deserve more attention and more just more focus. So yes, so finding things like musical pursuits, experiences, arts, athletics. This is where special interests can be such a strength and make all the difference if you find a way to pursue them and then to build a community around them. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the most common situations that comes up is navigating the legal transition towards adulthood, right? As we get closer to 16, 17, looking towards 18. At that point, a lot of families already know if we are going to be looking towards living an independent kind of pathway or if we're going to need some continued support. If we need some continued support, sometimes there is some reestablishment of care at that point, if care has been fragmented up until that point, to kind of guide the direction that we need to take to protect the child after they turn 18.
Yeah. Meaghan, I know you work with a lot of young adults and older teens.
Yeah, I think in some cases, the conversations and the visits where we're filling out paperwork for guardianship or conservatorship, those tend to go a lot more easily than some of the kids who are looking to transition to college or to like higher education settings or more independent living where it feels a lot scarier for families because that jump is so big compared to continuing to live at home and be supported by family. And I think one of the things that's really helped me is a better understanding of what supports and services tend to be available in the higher education settings. and being able to guide families that if your child's had an IEP, if they have these qualifying diagnoses, it doesn't mean that we've been so well supported in high school and then are just kind of left to float or flounder in that higher education setting. There are a lot of opportunities to carry over some of the really great accommodations.
Yeah, yeah. Let me get to just a couple other questions that I think are great for families to be thinking about. So, one is this idea that development doesn't stop. Development continues across the lifespan. So Haley, you just, talking about like there are always ways your brother who's in his 50s still learning new things, right? So his repertoire keeps growing. He can keep kind of pursuing things that he's curious or interested in. What kinds of skills would you say can still grow and change in adolescence and adulthood that parents might not be thinking about?
In addition to social skills, which I think really has been his biggest growth area, is being able to, continue to develop actual social skills past 18 for sure. A lot of it actually for him, I feel, has been a little bit fine motor, which is something that may not be completely intuitive, but there is a very strong connection between motivation and kind of fine motor skills. And I think as your motivation changes with time, as your interests change, and as you find more purpose in some of the things that perhaps tasks that did not seem to have that much purpose when you were younger, when there were other people who could always do them, I think there does become a point where you can feel that point of pride and start developing those skills yourself.
Yeah.
Navigating the community, I think, is one that a lot of families think kind of has a landing point. But I think as individuals grow and develop, again, I think motivation is a huge piece of it. So if we're wanting, I find a lot of autistic individuals, like they crave the age appropriate things, they crave more independence, they crave the ability um, to disagree with their families and like do things a little bit differently that we expect to see in teenagers and young adults.
I do occasionally have some patients who have a lot more anxiety around some of those skills, even if we think that skill is very much in their wheelhouse of things that we could be doing at this moment. And perhaps we have a bit of anxiety about initiating that task. In those kind of situations, I really do think that a lot of my families that have been very successful with instilling that skill, such as ordering from a restaurant, have done a little bit more scaffolding with it. And sometimes we have to kind of go back to observation and talking about it afterwards.
Yeah, there's a quote that I love from Maria Montessori, the educator, where she says, "Never do for a child what they could do for themselves." And it's hard. And Meaghan, you touched on this a little bit, where it takes patience, it takes more time. Haley's, as you said, it might take talking later, so just creating time and being intentional about it. But that's what allows for the gradual progression to happen over weeks, months, years. Well, both of you, in addition to your expertise in development and behavior, you are both experts in medical care for autism. And so I'm wondering how you think about physical health, especially strategies that families can use in everyday life.
I think nervous system regulation is a huge, huge piece of autism. We can recognize as adults that we might not be at our best when we're sick or when we're stressed or even when we're hungry. We might not be operating kind of at our fullest potential. And I think for a lot of individuals with autism, this can be perpetuated. It can be even more challenging to overcome those like instances of dysregulation. So for me, in promoting health and promoting nervous system regulation, it's finding the things that really work for that. And I think that movement and exercise, huge pieces of that.
Yeah, I think about it as opportunities to build that mind-body connection and potentially improve a little bit our skills with interoception as well, as far as being aware of what our body is telling us, but also how we feel after moving, after being outside, after having a good morning of being in the air and doing our movement, do we feel better? Um, and oftentimes, interoception is so difficult with kids who are on the autism spectrum or neurodivergent. It's so difficult to kind of build that skill and awareness, but sometimes some cause and effect, moments can really help with that. And that's part of regulation as well. How many people, when they have a difficult day, feel a little bit better after taking a walk, after going outside.
Yeah. Another topic I'd love to get your thoughts on is dating and relationships. So, families, as understandably, can often feel very unsure about kind of entering sort of this stage. And I'm curious what guidance you typically give families about supporting autistic teens and young adults to navigate relationships safely, respectfully, and successfully.
So for me, I find that consent and teaching about consent and body and who is in charge of the body and what moments, very, very important and very key, and can start from an early age. I practice with assent and consent based physical examinations. I think it's really important to try to continue that message as much as possible with kids and parents. That there are, people who this is appropriate for, and that list is very short, but you are in control of your body. And I think that there's a lot of situations where that actually does come up.
And then making sure we're being really direct. Dating, body changes, puberty.
I mean, that's the wonderful thing is there are so many more resources now and such a better understanding of how key and an important part this is, that sexuality is a human right. And so it's not an aspect of adulthood that should be neglected for autistic adults. Yeah.
Yeah.
One more thing I hear a lot from families is frustration about the systems, employment, education, healthcare, and how there's a lack of appropriate support in these major institutions and systems as autistic individuals, transition to adulthood. There's fewer healthcare services for autism-specific healthcare services for adults than there are for children. There are far fewer, of course, sort of career and employment opportunities, and often sort of educational support does fall off a cliff. You reach a certain age and then there is nothing. So, what changes would you like to see from a societal perspective?
The problem is also one of public perception, I feel. And to some extent, I think public perception is something that we need to work on improving so that we can have the policy support that we so badly need as a community actually in place for our teenagers as they transition into that adult world. Because it's so difficult, I think, to be in that position where, as somebody who has, a brother who does have autism, who is older than me, it's so interesting seeing as a child the difference between how people kind of treated him implicitly when he was young and cute versus when he is very clearly an adult with a developmental disability. And I've got to say, actually, people have been very, very much like positively surprising. At the same time, there is a general change in perception, right, between a young child with a developmental disability. Then you get kind of, the major league football teams come into the hospital to visit all the kids, and you've got your photos with your favorite singer or football player. And then once you kind of pass that 18 mark at some point, it becomes more, there's more space left for you in public areas. And you sort of have to navigate the looks, perhaps changing a little bit with time. And I think fundamentally that is something that we need to work on some level as a society.
I always think about accommodations. So we talked about nervous system regulation and the environmental aspects of that. Just being more flexible and willing to adapt environments or allow an individual to adapt their own environment. So wearing a t-shirt instead of a polo shirt, like if that collar is the rate limiter for you to be able to work in a setting comfortably and not become so overstimulated that you burn out and don't want to go back, that should be like a really small and easy change, but it can be doctor's notes and like medical justifications and letters just to even be able to consider it.
Yeah. Well, in closing, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. If you could leave parents with one message about the future for their autistic child, especially those with younger children who may not yet be thinking about the future as much or about adulthood, what would you want them to know about the possibilities ahead?
I always tell the parents of newly diagnosed children that we should continue to set our expectations high and just adjust our understanding of what supports we might need to get there.
I completely agree. I think it's so important to have a positive mindset. Sometimes when things really are stressful, that's difficult and you've got to just forcibly put one on. But it is evidence based to have a positive mindset. I think we can pleasantly surprise you with the fact that we see so many kids who grow and develop so much, even over relatively short periods of time, 4 or 5 years between 3, 4 years old and 8 years old. And look at what they're doing now. You never would have guessed it when they were 3 or 4 years old. There's so much room to be positive in a very statistically supported, evidence-based manner that if you don't kind of feel like you see it, I would encourage you to talk to your child's provider about it to see what they see and to borrow a little bit of their optimism.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. Well, to wrap up, I want to thank you both for sharing your experience and all of your incredible insights. One of the things I hope parents take away from today is that the transition to adulthood does not happen all at once. It's something we prepare for gradually through development, through supporting relationships, supporting health, and all the environments that we create for children, adolescents, and young adults. And with the right supports, really, we have seen so much in our practice. We know that autistic individuals can build extraordinary lives filled with purpose, connection, and joy. So thank you, Meaghan. Thank you, Dr. Masterson, for being here. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on Magnificent Minds. And if you found this episode helpful, please share it with another parent or professional who might benefit. Until next time, take good care of yourselves and the magnificent minds in your lives.